Okay, hello again. I'm going to continue with my reading of Trout Fishing in Chilean Rivers. This book, which I've already introduced to you by my grandfather, Alexander MacDonald. And I will now continue with chapter 2, some legal aspects. For my information on the legal side of trout fishing in Chile, I am indebted to two distinguished members of the legal profession in Santiago, Don Mariano Puga, 1899 to 1976. He was an advocate, member of the Chilean National Congress, and ambassador to the United States, 1957 to 1958, delegate at the General Assembly of the United Nations, 1963, and Don Benjamin Claro, probably Don Benjamin, or is it Benjamin, Claro Velasco, sometime Minister of Education, who are also keen fishermen. Don Benjamin Claro informs me that when he had an interview with the late President Franklin D. Roosevelt, that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, he was a lifelong avid fisherman. With the late President Roosevelt in Washington, one of the main topics of their conversation was fishing, and the president displayed a lively interest in all he was told about the rivers in the south of Chile. It is rather significant that outstanding men in all walks of life should be keen fishermen, and that in normal times, when they can slip away for a well-earned rest, they generally seek a quiet haven where they can devote themselves to their favorite sport. Anglers have always been regarded by their fellow citizens with a certain amount of suspicion as to their sanity, but surely the patronage of so many distinguished world figures must help them to live down this unenviable and unjust reputation. It would seem advisable, before going any further, to acquaint visiting fishermen with the legal conditions prevailing in Chile so that they may know where they stand. I shall endeavor to make this legal survey as concise as possible without sacrificing essential information, as I am afraid that a lengthy discussion on law might weary my readers. Only those sections of the law dealing with fishing in rivers and lakes and with trout are considered. All rivers in Chile are the property of the state, with the exception of those that rise and fall in the same property, over which the owners of such property have absolute rights. There has always been some doubt as to the correct interpretation of this exception, which, translated literally, reads, springs which are born and die within the same property. I believe that the opinion is now generally held that the exception only applies in the case of a stream having its source and coming to an end within one and the same property, and that a tributary of a main river itself does not fall within this definition, as the tributary or main river itself does not come to an end, but merges with the main river or the sea, as the case may be. It is difficult to imagine a trout stream rising and finally coming to an end within a property, and the practical effect of this interpretation of the law is that trout rivers in this country are all public property. All lakes in which a vessel of over 100 tons can navigate are also the property of the state, and all the important lakes connected with fishing are in this category. According to the law, the President of the Republic is authorized to concede private fishing rights over small portions of lakes, rivers, and streams for periods of 3 years at a time, subject to the payment of a consideration. It is inconceivable, however, that such fishing rights would be granted today, other than for commercial purposes in which the state might be interested. The tendency of legislation in this democratic country is socialistic, and the possibility of establishing private fishing rights may be dismissed as not merely unlikely, but in open conflict with national interests. It must also be remembered that fishing is a secondary feature of the rivers, which must be considered primarily from the standpoint of their importance for irrigation purposes. Nevertheless, it may become necessary for fishing rights to be granted in some of the best rivers if the fishing is to be preserved for the benefit of visitors from abroad. A further stipulation of the law is to the effect that, in addition to the river itself, a space of 5 meters on each bank is also public property, and owners of property are obliged to keep this space clear of crops, buildings, etc., for the benefit of fishermen. They are under no obligation, however, to give access to the river through their property, so that if such access be withheld, fishermen have to find their way to the river by the water's edge or the water itself. In certain cases, the difficulty of access is tantamount to the existence of private fishing rights, but such cases are so rare that they may be ignored for practical purposes. This question of access to the river is the most tricky point of the law, and opinions are by no means unanimous as to the rights of the fishermen in this respect. In some quarters, it is held that the fisherman can demand right of way to the river through any property, and that if refused, he is entitled to the assistance of the authorities to enforce his rights. My advisors state, however, that there is nothing laid down clearly in the law to support this argument, and that the fisherman would require to take action in the courts to establish his right of access. The best advice that can be given to the fisherman regarding this matter is that if his path to the river takes him through private property, he should ask politely for permission to go through. If such permission be refused, which is extremely unlikely, he should not argue about it, but leave at once and look for another river. The administration and control of fishing in Chile is vested in the Dirección General de Pesca y Caza, which will be known hereafter in this book briefly as the Department of Fisheries. The chief of the department, the Director General de Pesca y Caza, will be known as the Director of Fisheries. The right to fish in lakes, rivers, and streams can only be exercised by persons in possession of a license issued by the Department of Fisheries. The license for citizens and residents is annual and for tourists monthly. The tourist license refers only to certain of the principal rivers in the south and must be taken out by all fishermen, local and foreign alike. A fishing license, annual or monthly, costs at present 50 Chilean pesos, about 4 shillings or 50 cents American, and is easily obtained. It is prohibited to fish, purchase, sell, carry, or have in your possession trout during the period from 15th April to 15th of October of each year, the spawning or close season. There is an exception to this regulation in the central zone, in the region between the river Aconcagua in the north and the river Tinguiririca in the south, inclusive, in which fishing for rainbow trout is permitted up to 31st of May, provided that the catch is not sold in the market. In other words, this special provision applies only for sporting purposes. Trout measuring less than 30 centimeters, 11.8 inches, must be put back in the water. As a matter of interest, the regulation for salmon gives the minimum measurement of 40 centimeters, 15.75 inches, but you have to catch them first. You will hear more about salmon later. Traps can only be installed in rivers with the authority of the Department of Fisheries. If a dam or barrier be constructed in a river with a height of more than 60 centimeters, 23.6 inches, a fish ladder or fish pass must be provided to conform with the specifications of the Department of Fisheries. The manufacture of caviar from salmon or trout roe is prohibited. The use of dynamite or other explosives is expressly forbidden, and also the pollution of the rivers. Netting is forbidden, but there is a special proviso that the President of the Republic, on the advice of the Department of Fisheries, may authorize netting temporarily in rivers where there is a superabundance of fish. In such cases of authorized netting, the mesh of the net for trout must show a minimum width or opening of 40 millimeters, about 1.5 inches. The functions of fishing police are vested in the Cuerpo de Carabineros, the police force of the Republic. The Director of Fisheries may also appoint ad honorem fishing inspectors for a period of 2 years, subject to re-election. The duties of such inspectors, who are generally well-known fishermen, are to report contraventions of the law and to cooperate in the enforcement thereof. For identification purposes, they are supplied with a special license by the Director of Fisheries. There is nothing more to tell you about trout fishing legislation in Chile, which I think is adequate for present-day requirements, except that for one minor defect, namely that the minimum size of trout which can be taken, while reasonable in the south, is too large for the central zone and should be adjusted accordingly. As far as a visitor is concerned, the practical effect of the law is that, provided that he procures a license, he may fish anywhere and must put back all trout measuring less than, say, 12 inches. I doubt whether there is any country in the world where the law is more liberal to the fishermen and where there are fewer restrictions than in Chile. So now continuing with chapter 3, climatic and general conditions. If you look at the map of Chile and the Argentine Republic, you will observe a curious fact that the great majority of the rivers rising in the Andean mountain ranges are on the Chilean side of the mountains. My only comment is to congratulate Chile on what appears to be a remarkable stroke of good fortune. The map of Chile is rather an unwieldy document on account of the long and narrow shape of the country, and for the sake of convenience, I am dividing the fishing map into 3 zones, namely 1, the central zone, 2, the intermediate zone, and 3, the southern zone. As the fishing characteristics and climatic conditions are somewhat different in each zone, the subdivision has much to commend it apart from a matter of convenience. My fishing zones may be roughly defined as follows, reading from north to south. Central zone from Los Andes, the river Aconcagua, to Talca. The river or Rio Aconcagua enters the Pacific Ocean 12 miles north of Valparaiso. The intermediate zone from Talca, which is a city about 158 miles south of Santiago, to Lautaro. And the southern zone from Lautaro, which is a city in Chile's Araucania region, to the extreme south. The fishing qualities of the respective zones may be summed up briefly as central zone good, intermediate zone better, and southern zone best. On discussing this proposed subdivision of fishing zones in this country with experienced fishermen, they all concur that the Department of Fisheries should have some such subdivision in the law. As an immediate illustration of the different features of the zones I have suggested, the average size of trout is different in each zone, yet the law stipulates 1 minimum size of trout, which can be taken for the whole of Chile. My readers in the Northern Hemisphere will forgive me for reminding them of the obvious fact that the seasons in Chile are exactly the reverse of theirs. Our fishing season for trout commences in the middle of October and ends in the middle of April each year. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, a seasonal distinction is drawn between rainbow and brown trout, but this only applies to a sector of the central zone and is therefore of minor importance as it does not go far enough. The seasons for rainbow and brown trout are, of course, quite distinct, and the proper season should be made effective throughout the entire Republic. But I suppose that the authorities take the view that under present conditions, the advantages of having fixed dates for the duration of the season outweigh the advantages of catering to the idiosyncrasies of the various species of fish. It would certainly be very difficult, if not impossible, to control the seasonal distinction in this country at present. The paramount importance of the weather to the fishermen gives it a right to early consideration, and it is a subject which I approach with diffidence. However, my readers know as well as I do that there is no golden rule about it, and my intention is merely to give a general idea of the weather which may be expected in a normal season in Chile, while at the same time mentioning some of the particular difficulties the visitor may have to contend with in the south on account of unseasonable changes and other local disturbances. In the central zone, there is virtually no rain during the fishing season. And apart from the coastal districts, it is very hot in the months of January and February, although fortunately there is little or no humidity about it and the nights are cool. The mean temperature in the summer months in Santiago and environs, for instance, is about 85 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, and sometimes it reaches 95 degrees. In these months, the main efforts of the inhabitants in this part of Chile are directed towards getting away from the heat to the coast or the south. Between the central zone and the south, in what I describe as the intermediate zone, the chances of good weather in the summer months are favorable and rain is infrequent, or in other words, you have far more chance of escaping rain than in the far south. In the southern zone, it is generally conceded that January and February are the only months where one has a reasonable prospect of avoiding rain altogether, or nearly so. The weather in Chile, however, is no less treacherous than elsewhere in the world, and I remember a few years ago when it rained every day except one in February in the south. In the months of November, December, and March, I should say that the chances of good weather are about even, and in October and April, the odds are in favor of bad weather. In those 2 months, it is a matter of luck, although in my own experience, I have rarely run into bad weather fishing in April. When it does rain, however, it is generally no half-hearted affair, and my advice to the visitor from abroad is to come prepared for bad weather. In the south, it can be warm in January and February, but generally speaking, the temperature is very pleasant throughout the summer, and it is only in the early part or late in the fishing season that cold weather need be feared. The prevailing and fair weather wind in Chile is the south wind, the converse of which is that the moment the wind veers round to the north, you may look for trouble. A troublesome wind in the south in the summer is the puelche, which in each place has its own peculiar local characteristics, but is generally understood to be a strong warm wind which comes over the Cordillera from the sun-beaten Argentine plains. This wind occasionally lasts for several days, usually 1 or 3 and hardly ever 2, and gathers strength as each day progresses. There is not the slightest doubt that it affects the fishing adversely, much more than the ordinary wind, and when it is prevalent, the wise fisherman will concentrate his energies on the early morning before the wind rises, or on the evening if and when it has dropped temporarily. While the puelche, P-U-E-L-C-H-E, is at its height, there is little chance of catching fish, and the conditions are rather unpleasant. The temperature in the south is at times affected by forest fires, which in recent years have been unduly prevalent and quite serious in some parts. The authorities are now taking the matter in hand and attempting to stop or control such fires, which are generally caused by the small landowner desirous of clearing forest land and extending his crops. It seems a crime to see forests disappearing in this crude fashion, leaving behind a picture of wanton destruction reminiscent of the Western Front in the year 1918, of which my grandfather was all too familiar, which detracts considerably from the beauty of the country. The argument of the small landholder, of course, is that he has to live. It must also be borne in mind that to all intents and purposes, there is no other way of clearing the land at present, as machinery brought in for this work is extremely limited. The Andes mountain range has a number of volcanoes, all more or less active in a quiet way. And there have been cases where rivers have been seriously affected by volcanic disturbances. Some years ago, certain rivers contained thousands of dead fish towards the end of the season, and volcanic ash deposits were claimed to be the cause. You will hear more about this when I deal with Puye-hue. A volcano eruption sometimes causes a considerable rise in temperature in the surrounding district, and in some way or another, which nobody seems able to explain, volcanic disturbances in the water must be the reason for the fish dying. In the 1940 season, the Climatic volcano east of Temuco was in eruption, and in combination with forest fires was said to have been the reason for the heat wave in that district and even further south. For 10 days or more, the temperature in Pucón and other parts of the south was around 90 degrees Fahrenheit and actually touched 95 degrees, which is extremely unusual. There were no reports, however, of damage in the rivers, although the fishing was undoubtedly affected adversely while the heat wave lasted. In the summer of 1948-49, which obviously proves this is part of the revised manuscript, the Villarrica volcano became much more active, and there were several serious eruptions, the first of which caused some loss of life and property. The lava melted the snow around the peak, and water rushed down the mountainside in torrents, carrying everything, farmhouses, bridges, rocks, etc., in its course. There were reports of dead fish and serious damage to the fishing, but happily these were exaggerated. In an occasional summer, and particularly after it has been hot, The tabano, which is a large-sized horsefly, can make things unpleasant. In the Lake District around Ensenada, it is a hardy annual and never fails in late December and January. In February, fortunately, it disappears. You will have no difficulty in identifying this fly if he should be around. I have known of cases where fishermen have left the river because they could not put up with the tabanos, which will give you some idea of how troublesome they can be on occasions. It is also said that fishermen have been seen wearing veils and gloves, but this may be an exaggeration. In my own experience, I have never been seriously worried by insects on Chilean rivers. I gather also that it is safe to say that anyone who has experienced the flies and other crawlers on American and Canadian rivers will decide that we have nothing to complain about in Chile. There are no poisonous snakes in Chile, and the small specimen one occasionally sees on the riverbank is quite innocuous. The visitor from abroad must not be alarmed at the possibility of having his fishing holiday ruined by such climatic conditions and local disturbances as I have mentioned, which are extremely rare. The chances are that in the average season, he will enjoy good weather and good sport. The south of Chile, with its extensive system of interconnected lakes and rivers, is particularly well suited for the development of salmon and trout. The lakes act as huge reservoirs for the fish and are more in the nature of inland seas. As regards the rivers, there is little to say beyond the statement that they are typical salmon and trout rivers with all the usual characteristics, and I trust that the photographs shown in the book, unfortunately, there are no photos with the manuscript, I wonder where they went, will give my readers a good idea of what they look like. They rise in the Andean mountain range, are fed in the spring and early summer by the melted snow, and pursue their short, mad course. No river in Chile is more than 240 kilometers or 150 miles long, and most of them are shorter, over a rocky and gravelly bed, broken by falls, rapids, cataracts, and cascades until they reach the sea. Perhaps I should be more explicit and say that the early or mountainous part of their course is precipitous and often causes a raging torrent. As they approach the sea, they gradually widen and become bigger and quieter until they finish up in a broad estuary at the sea coast. The water is cold enough for salmon and trout, especially in the south, where the trout thrive and grow to unusually big sizes. In the central zone, in recent years, a succession of dry winters with the consequent scarcity of snow almost dried up some of the trout streams, and it surprised the local fishermen that the trout continued to exist in the small quantity of apparently tepid water which remained towards the end of the season. The past few winters have been fortunately more normal in rainfall in the central zone, and the streams are benefiting accordingly. For some considerable time, I have been accumulating data regarding river temperatures in Chile and find that the temperature in the southern rivers, such as the Trancura and the Enco, varies between 48 and 54 degrees Fahrenheit during the fishing season, while the surface waters of the lakes, such as Villarica and Panguipulli, which are quite deep, show temperatures varying between 60 and 70 degrees. In the month of March, the Colanco stream, which is in the central zone near Santiago, registered a temperature at midday of 62 degrees, which must be considered highly satisfactory in view of the small amount of water in the stream at that date, while another stream near Santiago, the Molina, with more water, showed a temperature in the evening of 55 degrees. In those small mountain streams, during the hottest part of the summer, the morning and evening temperatures vary as much as 8 degrees. In previous seasons, after abnormally dry winters, the water temperature in central zone streams must have reached 70 degrees at times, I imagine, although this is guesswork. The main rivers, as they approach the sea, lose their clarity and become discolored, and in the height of summer, almost tepid in temperature, so that it is only in the region towards the mountains that conditions for trout are favorable. Furthermore, in the central zone, the main rivers, Aconcagua, Maipo, etc., are muddy practically all the year round, and it is only in the tributaries, the mountain streams, that the water is clear. As you proceed from north to south, the tendency is for the main rivers to become clearer, but broadly speaking, it is not until you reach Temuco that there is any fishing west of the main railway line, that is to say, in the seaward direction. There is little or no pollution in Chilean rivers, as of course most of the rivers or the fishable waters are in the Cordillera district away from the big towns. The river Mapocho, which flows through Santiago, gets the tailings from the Disputada copper mines and is scorned by trout and fishermen alike. Some years ago, the lower reaches of the River San Pedro were occasionally fouled by the operations at a gold washing plant on one of the tributaries. The upper reaches of the Bio were similarly affected in certain sections and for short distances by gold washing operations. Apart from these cases, I cannot recall detrimental reports regarding any other rivers in the country, and I'm sure that they are singularly free from pollution. The law protects the rivers and lakes and the inhabitants thereof from damage which may result from impure residues from farms, factories, or mines, as it is stipulated that such residues must be rendered innocuous before they enter the waters. Trout in the south of Chile have always had a reputation for their good condition, but for the past 2 years, in certain rivers in the south, they have been affected by a species of worm. When a fish is taken in bad condition, you may expect to find the existence of worm, and unfortunately, it is stated that the worm can also affect human beings. In the summer of 1951, a government commission made a study of this matter and presented a report. Again, in this last summer, another commission was engaged in a further examination of the problem. Whatever the official report may or may not disclose, it is a good idea to ensure that any trout you may eat has been properly cooked. An important factor affecting the trout rivers and streams in the central zone, and to a lesser degree in the intermediate zone, is that every year more and more water is being drawn off for irrigation purposes. The effect in the small mountain streams is that it is only right up in the mountainous regions that there is any water left late in the season, and the fish are overcrowded. In the bigger rivers in the intermediate zone, the water becomes low towards the end of the season, but the fishing is apparently unaffected. In any event, I am afraid that nothing can be done about this matter, as irrigation has a prior claim to the water. Many cormorants and ducks are to be found on Chilean rivers. The cormorant is the natural enemy of the trout and takes a heavy toll, indeed a much heavier toll than the fishermen. With the possible exception of the Bio River in the intermediate zone, it is only in the south that rivers can be fished from a boat, and generally speaking, a flat-bottomed boat can be handled without much difficulty, despite the strength of the current and the occasional rapids which have to be surmounted. A canoe would be very useful on the swifter rivers, and it is rather surprising that it has not yet been introduced into Chile, as one was tried successfully some years ago. In the rivers in the central and intermediate zone, with little exception, it is all bank fishing and wading. In the majority of rivers in the south, there are many places where the fly fishermen can get out of the boat and wade or fish from the bank, particularly on the islands which divide the rapids or heavy current. For bank fishing in the south, the best time to fish is obviously in March and April when the water is low. There are very few dry fly fishermen in Chile, and the reason for this is chiefly that the conditions are generally deemed to be more suitable for the use of the wet fly. In the small mountain streams in the central zone, the only way to catch the better trout in the crystal pools towards the end of the season is with a dry fly, and in the big rivers in the intermediate and southern zones, there are many still waters away from the current where the dry fly angler can get all the sport he wants in suitable weather. I have seen the rivers in the south on still summer evenings, literally boiling with trout, rising apparently to moths and other insects hovering on the water. I have tried them with every conceivable fly in my bag on many occasions without the slightest success. Once in a while, I have got a few on a coachman, but generally they have defeated me, and I am sure that the expert dry fly angler would be in his element under such conditions. I have never seen anything resembling a big hatch of fly on a Chilean river, nor is it likely, as the underwater conditions in such rapid waters are not conducive to the intensive breeding of insects. The flies and other insects that one sees on the surface are mostly land-bred insects, many of which come from the overhanging trees and branches on the river, and waterbred flies are in the minority and scarce. The trout have to depend for their food mainly on freshwater crabs and other crustaceans, snails, slugs, tadpoles, beetles, caterpillars, worms, etc., and unfortunately, in waters where food is scarce, on small trout. A favorite food for the trout is the small pejerrey, or freshwater herring, which is unfortunately on the decline in Chilean rivers. The freshwater crab, apancora, is a great delicacy for the trout. It is said that the crabs are migratory and that the rivers are replenished annually with food for the trout by the migration of many thousands of crabs from the sea shores. Whether or not this is the case, there is no doubt that the condition for the trout in the southern rivers depends to a great extent on the supply of crabs and other crustaceans available. It is also an accepted fact that the vivid color of the flesh of the trout in the southern water of Chile is due to the abundance of crustaceans available as food. The trout, therefore, are ground or bottom feeders in this country as a general rule, and that is the reason why the wet fly is the preferred of fly fishermen, and also why spoons, minnows, flatfish, and orenos or plugs are almost infallible. Standard patterns of wet fly are so generally successful that very few anglers in this country trouble to study the flies on the water, and it is only on rare occasions, such as the still summer evenings I have described, that they find themselves in any difficulty. Although the dry fly does yield a heavy creel, that's a wicker basket for holding fish, in Chilean waters, its use requires special skill and involves extra pains. It is not surprising, therefore, that while good catches can be made with the wet fly, few will forsake it for the more delicate art. The select few who do devote themselves to the dry fly in this country claims that it can be used on most of the rivers in Chile and will often prove more successful than the wet fly. One of them tells me that drag on the dry fly, so studiously avoided by the experts in Great Britain, is sometimes desirable with the rainbow, and that on propounding this heresy to an expert on holiday in this country, he confirmed that the same was true in New Zealand. And that's the end of chapter 3. I think I will stop the video here.